Mark chapter 10, beginning at verse 46. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. This is the word of the Lord.
So we don't really know a huge amount about Bartimaeus. He's only mentioned in Mark's Gospel. Although the story, at least one's very similar to it, appears in both Matthew and Luke. I'm going to assume, for the purposes of the video that I will show in a minute, that Bartimaeus is the unnamed man in the Luke story. So what's going on here? Jesus is travelling to Jerusalem, where he will be welcomed as the Saviour of the Jews, and I'm sure most of you will know the story of the triumphal entry. And then a couple of days later, the crowd will turn on him and he will be crucified. So try to imagine the scene. It's almost Passover. That's the biggest festival on the Jewish calendar. And there are thousands of people heading towards Jerusalem. Jesus and his disciples have just passed through Jericho. And Jesus was reaching a high point for his reputation amongst the people on earth at the time. The crowds are no doubt eager to hear what he is saying, especially to those closest to him. There is a sense of excitement, perhaps more so than usual, because this might promise to be a very special Passover. They believe that God's kingdom is about to be proclaimed in Jerusalem. The hated Romans thrown out and Jewish self-rule reinstated. You wouldn't think it meant much to a blind beggar, especially one whose name means son of uncleanness. Now, whether that uncleanness refers to his father, perhaps he was a leper or something like that, or whether it's a name that Bartimaeus has picked up en route, we can't really be sure. Either way, it puts Bartimaeus right at the bottom of the pile. Just the sort of person that you would have the Pharisees expecting to be afflicted by blindness or something terrible. Of course, we don't know whether he was blind from birth or whether some illness had made him blind during his early life. But then, heading towards Passover is probably a good time for beggars, particularly if you can get yourself on the main road to Jerusalem. Even though the crowds are excited and busily going somewhere, there are lots more people than usual, and some of them are bound to take pity on you. Some of them are bound to give you something. Being blind in first century Palestine meant there was really nothing you could do. There was no paid work for a blind man. There was no braille system to allow them to read. But to survive, of course, you needed food and water. And the only way to get that is to beg. Passing crowds would all be carrying small amounts of food, as we all do when we go on a long journey. And many of them would be willing to part with the odd crust. So perhaps it was a good time, relatively speaking, for beggars. In the not so good times, of course, Bartimaeus had had plenty of time to sit and think. And I'm sure that just like today, the beggars are involved in conversations with the people who give them things. So there was Bartimaeus, sitting by the side of the road, hoping and praying that it would be, for him at least, a good day. That by the end of it, he would feel a little less hungry than he usually did. Now I'm going to show that video that I mentioned. So for the sound people, I'm going to walk in front of the speaker and press the button. Preserve my ears, please.
What do you want me to do for you?
I want to see it.
Then see. Your faith has made you well.
I can see. I can see. I can see.
That's taken from the Jesus film. But when I watched it, it occurred to me straight away that there are some things that are not quite right with it as far as the text goes. Now, it's based on Luke, and that's in Luke 18:35 to 43. If you want to go and read it after lunch, don't read it now. But the story is essentially the same. So what do you think was missing from that video? Yes? Yep. Yes, exactly, Lauren. Thank you. That's exactly what struck me as well. The whole reaction of the crowd is missing. I'm sure that's a good editorial decision, but we know that editorial decisions aren't always good, don't we? So I thought we might now try and reenact that a little bit. I wonder... I haven't got anything to bribe them with. They're going to have to be good. Children, would you be a crowd for me? Would you walk past? If you're going to be a walking crowd, you have to move, I'm afraid. I'm sorry. I know it's unusual, but you're going to have to move. So if you stand here, you know what you have to do? I'm going to pretend to be a beggar. Now, a beggar doesn't normally wear a suit or a microphone, but you just have to pretend, okay? I'm going to sit on the side there, and I'm going to say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And every time I say it, you've got to tell me to be quiet. But you've got to tell me more forcibly the second time, and even more forcibly the third time. Can you do that? And you've got to walk while you're doing it. That's a lot of stage directions, I know. Can you do that? Can you improvise? Let's try. I'm going to move this even further forward. Start walking. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Join in, join in. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Thank you very much. I'm not sure what the boos were for, but thank you very much. And let's say, we don't know, but let's say that after the third time, Jesus stopped and turned around. Why did Jesus stop for this guy? One of the things I thought that the video got right was that there were lots of beggars sitting on the side of the road. There must have been people everywhere trying to listen to what Jesus was saying. You can imagine people in the crowd jockeying for position so they could hear what Jesus was saying to his disciples and those up front. Perhaps it was that call. Perhaps it was the repetition. Perhaps it was the determination that Bartimaeus showed. Or perhaps it was the words that he used. If you look through the Gospels, you will find that this is the first time, chronologically, that Jesus has been called Son of David in public. Once he got to Jerusalem, of course, he would hear, Hosanna to the Son of David, as the chant from the crowd. But that's probably a day away from this incident. The only people who were close enough to Jesus to have seen all the evidence and to really understand who Jesus were the disciples, and we know that they didn't make a particularly good job of it. But Bartimaeus, it seems, had worked it out for himself from the things he'd heard, the stories of what Jesus was doing, and no doubt, I'm sure, his love of Scripture, because as a Jew he would have been brought up absolutely immersed in what we call the Old Testament. So Jesus stops because he's heard the truth shouted from the crowd. He's heard someone say effectively, here is the Messiah. Here is the one we're all expecting. Maybe even Jesus was a little surprised. So he says, call him. And you know how it is with a crowd. The mood changes immediately. Instead of trying to get Bartimaeus to be quiet, they all want to know what will happen when he's standing face to face with Jesus. Come on, get up, you old beggar. He's calling you. Well, he couldn't have been that old, could he? Because the text says he threw off his coat and he jumped to his feet. If you spend most of your day sitting begging, you won't have a huge amount of physical strength. So jumping to your feet will be quite a task once you reach middle age. And Jesus asks the question, what do you want me to do for you? A good question, because who knows? He might have been quite accustomed to being blind. He might have decided that nothing could ever happen about that. And he might have wanted something else from Jesus. But no, as we know from the story, he says, Rabbi, I want to see. Bartimaeus' life is about to change. Once you can see, begging will not really be an option anymore. Anyone who is well and capable should be working, not begging. Begging was the social security system of the day. An obvious disability would have meant that you would receive stuff from people. Anything else, and they would think you were trying to pull a fast one. And Jesus says, go, your faith has healed you. And this is probably one of the most straightforward healings that we have a record of. There's no fiddling about with making mud and putting it on his eyes like there is in John 9. No requirement to go and wash in a particular place. And the John 9 story ends with the person being told to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. But that teaching in John was a healing teaching exercise. And the man's faith demonstrated by the fact that he followed the instructions that Jesus gave him. Bartimaeus had already shown his faith. He'd been shouting out above the noise of the crowd, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. This healing is more like the woman who had been subject to bleed for 12 years. She pushed through the crowd, hoping to touch Jesus' cloak, convinced that just a touch would result in her healing. That's in Matthew 9. When she did finally get through and touch his cloak, she was healed. And Jesus' response to her was essentially the same as his response to Bartimaeus. But did you notice that Bartimaeus did not obey Jesus? Once he was healed, Jesus had said, "Go, your faith has healed you." But he didn't return and pick up his coat. He just joined the crowd and followed Jesus towards Jerusalem. This has led some Bible scholars to suggest that Bartimaeus had joined the wider group of disciples and later became a leader in the early church. I don't think that really stands up to examination, because the other Gospels don't have a record of Bartimaeus' name. Had he been a leader in the church, he would have been more widely known, and those people writing would have known who he was. It's much more likely that he was just known to the person who wrote Mark, and not to the writers of the other Gospels. It doesn't imply he wasn't a leader, but it certainly implies that he wasn't a very important leader. So what do we learn from Bartimaeus? Well, whatever became of him, he teaches us some important things about faith. Bartimaeus knew that there was only one chance for him to see. He had to be healed by Jesus. I'd like to suggest that he'd spent quite a long time thinking and praying about who Jesus was. He'd identified Jesus as the Messiah. We know that because of what he said. He'd worked it out. He'd prayed about it. And when his chance came, he was not going to miss out, no matter what. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Crowds can be fickle things, and the situation could easily have turned nasty. But as it threatened to, Bartimaeus was not deterred. His resolve was strengthened. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." This was his chance, his one and only chance. He's not going to have another to make Jesus hear, to just get Jesus' attention. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus did. Bartimaeus knew that he wanted and needed Jesus. There was nothing else. There was no one else who could make a difference. A.W. Tozer says, "Before we can be filled with the Spirit, the desire to be filled must be all-consuming. It must be, for the time, the biggest thing in the life, so acute, so intrusive as to crowd out everything else. The degree of fullness in any life accords perfectly with the intensity of true desire. We have as much of God as we actually want." Bartimaeus knew that he needed all of Jesus, if only for those few seconds that it took for Jesus to say, "Go, your faith has made you well." But once you have all of Jesus, anything else doesn't feel like real life at all. I often say, there is always more with God, and it's true. But to get it, we have to want it. God is not going to come and apply it. He's not going to overwhelm you. We have to believe that it's there, and we have to be asking. So perhaps we can say with Bartimaeus, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And if we do, he will.